We've all heard the stories of fictional worlds that feel so real they inspire real-life change. But what happens when the storytellers themselves are accused of pulling the ultimate deliberate deception?
Right.
Today, we are diving deep into a media storm surrounding the final season of a beloved globally dominant series, exploring the intense claims that its creators executed the most elaborate, cruelest queerbait in media history.
And we're examining why this particular controversy means so much more than just a fictional romance to a massive, highly engaged portion of the audience.
It's a fascinating case study, really.
It is, because the emotional reaction went far beyond, typical audience disappointment. It felt like a perceived narrative betrayal, almost a contract broken between the creators and a devoted segment of their viewers.
So our mission here is to really dissect these reactions, which are often conflicting, focusing entirely on the controversy around the Mike and Will relationship.
A pairing known within the fandom as Byler. We need to unpack the meticulous evidence fans cited, analyze the resulting psychological impact, and examine how the creator's own defense just fueled this international firestorm.
Okay, let's unpack this and start with the core concept that drives this entire critique: queerbaiting. It's a term that has evolved, but for those who are just catching up on this, we need a precise definition.
At its core, queerbaiting is a calculated narrative and marketing strategy. It's when fiction creators, usually through subtext, visual cues, or suggestive dialogue, hint at the possibility of a same-sex romance or strong LGBTQ+ representation.
But they never follow through.
They absolutely never follow through or depict that relationship explicitly.
That sounds like a cynical strategy designed to walk a very specific, profitable tightrope.
It is entirely strategic. The purpose is twofold, and it's usually corporate-driven. First, you attract and energize the massive, underserved audience of queer viewers and straight allies who are desperate for meaningful representation.
So you secure their loyalty.
You secure their intense loyalty and viewership. We are talking about massive amounts of emotional investment and attention here.
And the second part.
Second, and this is critical, by never making the pairing explicit, the creators can safely avoid alienating any homophobic audience members or running into issues with network censors or distribution markets that might shy away from actual queer relationships.
It's the promise of representation without the political or commercial cost of delivery.
Precisely.
The distinction here is crucial, though, because critics argue that what happened with this series went far beyond just casual subtext. Our sources, including commentary from a prominent figure dubbed the Byler lawyer, assert that the scale and detail of the hint,
which were often presented as literal exhibits intended to be paid off.
Right. They argue that this makes it the most elaborate queerbait in media history.
Exactly. The level of detail was such that the fan base felt they were not just reading into the material, but actively decoding the narrative that the showrunners had provided.
So the intensity comes from that feeling of certainty.
It comes from the assertion that none of us are wrong. The Duffer brothers, Sean Levy, and Netflix are wrong. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Critics argue they were strung along with specific false hope, leading to a profound disservice to the marginalized and outcast communities who identified so deeply with the character struggles.
That feeling of being strung along leads directly to the sense of active betrayal, especially given the narrative direction of the final season. We need to detail the timeline shift that fans identified.
The criticism hinges entirely on the change between the two volumes of the final season.
Volume 1 and Volume 2.
Yes. The consensus among the critics was that Volume 1 was actively building the Byler relationship. We saw Will's emotional breakdown, the coded language, the deep vulnerability. It created this undeniable narrative momentum towards a resolution.
And then Volume 2 dropped.
Then, abruptly, Volume 2 seemed to tear all of that down, reversing course and essentially resetting the relationship to a platonic baseline.
So the claim isn't just that the ship didn't sail, but that they absolutely built up hope across multiple seasons, only to ultimately chicken out in the final moments.
That's the core of it.
If the narrative shift was so abrupt, what is the running theory as to why this late-stage creative reversal might have happened?
The dominant speculation points toward a powerful external corporate influence intervening late in the process. The running theory suggests that some form of internal power struggle occurred behind the scenes.
Involving who?
Potentially involving Netflix executives concerned about the direction, or even external partners like Paramount. You have to remember, the Duffer Brothers had a high-profile future production deal lined up with Paramount.
So the fear is that the decision to subvert the established queer narrative, the subtext that the fans had identified, was a business decision.
Exactly. Designed to protect future corporate investments by sanitizing the show's ending.
And that theory of external interference makes the creator's subsequent statements about the audience feel like adding insult to injury. How did the creative team publicly respond to all this Byler enthusiasm?
Their public defense was incredibly dismissive, which I think became the main source of the intense backlash. The creators later characterized Byler fans' intense enthusiasm and deep, meticulous analysis.
The very engagement they had encouraged for years.
The very engagement they had fostered, yes. They called it nothing more than external pressure and noise that they consciously chose to block out while writing the final script.
Calling a massive segment of your devoted audience noise? That sounds profoundly condescending, especially when that segment consists of the very outcasts and marginalized youth the show was supposedly championing.
It was overwhelmingly perceived that way, yes. Critics pointed out that fans spent years analyzing every visual clue or every musical drop, every line of dialogue, because the showrunners consistently encouraged this level of Easter egg hunting.
So to then label that analysis as mere noise,
it was interpreted as equating those avid queer viewers and allies to people who don't matter. This act of public dismissal, according to the sources, demonstrated a profound lack of respect for the audience's years of investment, cementing the feeling that the creators had betrayed the show's core message.
Here is where the deep dive really begins. The complexity of the fans' analysis is truly staggering. They weren't just guessing. They were decoding specific narrative structures and cinematic techniques.
And this analysis requires a degree of media literacy that is, frankly, amazing. The fans demonstrated an understanding of screenwriting tropes and visual language that rivals that of film school students.
Let's start with the most compelling structural evidence, the use and subsequent alleged bastardization of the Cyrano trope. For context, can you remind us what the traditional mechanism of the Cyrano de Bergerac story demands?
Sure. The Cyrano trope, based on the 1897 play, involves a character, the Cyrano, who loves someone but feels inherently unworthy or flawed, often due to their appearance or social standing, so they can't declare their feelings directly.
So they use a go-between.
They express that love through a proxy, usually a friend who is more conventionally attractive or socially adept.
And the essential traditional payoff. What has to happen for the trope to work?
The absolute necessity of the traditional trope is that the love interest must eventually discover the deception.
The truth has to come out.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
They have to recognize that the true source of genuine, deep feeling, the intellectual and emotional connection, lies with the Cyrano. They then reject the proxy and choose the authentic source of love. The triumph of truth is the whole point.
So how is this applied to the Mike and Will relationship in the final season?
Will, undeniably, was the Cyrano figure. He created the painting, a deeply personal, carefully crafted gift, which critics immediately identified as the declaration of his genuine love and deep emotional understanding of Mike.
But he doesn't say it's from him.
No. In a moment of extreme vulnerability, he masks those feelings. He claims the painting and the emotional articulation of Mike's character were actually Elle's feelings for Mike.
That setup created a powerful ticking clock. It implied that the eventual discovery of Will's lie would force Mike to confront his own feelings and the depth of his connection to Will, leading to that necessary emotional truth.
That's the critical point. But the narrative subverted this entirely. In the finale, the painting lie was never acknowledged, never discovered, and never addressed by Mike.
So Mike still thinks the painting was from Elle.
He still believes the painting was purely Elle's work and her sentiment.
So instead of leading to truth, the trope was inverted.
Precisely. This is what critics called a bastardization of the trope. Instead of the Cyrano finding resolution, the writers used the vulnerable, traumatized queer character's feelings, Will's genuine self-sacrificing love, not to grant him happiness,
but to fix a straight relationship.
Yes. To successfully fix a straight relationship, Mike and Elle, which was struggling due to Mike's emotional inconsistency, Will's most honest, most painful moment was effectively harvested to prop up the heterosexual main pairing.
Denying the queer character the emotional catharsis that the trope fundamentally requires.
That's the critique. It goes deeper than mere shipping. It suggests an active decision by the writers to prioritize the comfort of the straight pairing over the integrity and emotional journey of the queer character.
Making Will's love secondary to Elle's happiness.
That's the exact interpretation. It suggests that Will's deep inner life was valuable only insofar as it functioned as emotional fertilizer for others. The audience was effectively told that the painful, genuine feelings of the queer character are acceptable only as a fuel source to maintain the status quo.
Beyond the structural evidence like Cyrano, the Byler fanbase pointed to a stunning level of detail in visual and auditory cues details that only become apparent if you're watching with a highly critical cinematic eye.
Oh, the visual evidence is extensive. It suggests the creators were highly deliberate in their queer coding. A major recurring motif cited by fans was the closet symbolism.
And this wasn't a one-off joke.
Not at all. It appeared consistently throughout the series, referencing the common metaphor of being in the closet.
Can you give us some specific examples that critics pointed to?
The most direct one involves Mike's father, Ted, who is often portrayed as emotionally disconnected. Critics highlighted a scene where Ted symbolically smashes Mike's actual bedroom closet door.
I remember that.
There was also a notable shot of a one-way sign pointing directly toward Mike's closet. But the most explicit piece of coding occurred at the Rinkermania roller rink.
The music drop there was significant, wasn't it?
It was highly significant. During that sequence, the song In the Closet by Michael Jackson, which deals explicitly with themes of hiding a secret love, plays while the camera pans directly toward Mike.
Wow.
Critics argue that placing that particular song at that particular time and drawing the audience's eye directly to the character associated with the physical symbol of secrecy is not accidental. It is intentional cinematic signaling.
We also have the specific use of color coding.
Yes, the official colors of the Byler fandom blue and yellow became an unofficial flag. Fans found these colors intentionally placed in countless Easter eggs throughout the show. Things like blue and yellow swings, and the specific color combination of the Dungeons & Dragons books the boys frequently used. Again, this points to the creators rewarding the deeply observant fan base who believed they were following a carefully constructed subtextual trail.
But the use of music in the finale introduced a deep, almost malicious layer of irony that many critics found unforgivable. Let's talk about the irony of using David Bowie and Prince.
This is where the critique of manipulation is strongest. David Bowie's Heroes played during the closing credits.
A song a lot of people in the fandom already associated with them.
Exactly. The sources point out that the song is strongly associated with the Byler dynamic. Its original version is famously sung by Bowie, who is openly bisexual, and the lyrics describe a forbidden love that society looks down upon, yet the lovers choose to be heroes just for one day.
So what's the criticism there?
Critics felt the showrunners were offering lip service to heroism by using the song signaling depth, but arguing that the creators were not being heroic themselves by refusing to validate that forbidden love with a canonical ending.
And the use of Prince's music during Mike and Elle's climactic scene, that was viewed as the ultimate act of creative trolling.
Absolutely. The show used When Doves Cry and later Purple Rain in the Melvin scenes. This choice was highly charged. Prince's work, particularly Purple Rain, holds immense symbolic weight within the queer community.
Because of his celebration of gender fluidity and defiance of boundaries.
Right. Furthermore, Prince's estate is notoriously difficult when it comes to licensing his music. For the showrunners to secure the rights for these specific, expensive, and symbolically heavy songs, only to use them to score the definitive straight romance scene.
Knowing the fandom's attention to detail.
O was called evil and deeply manipulative. It reinforced the idea that the creators were actively baiting and mocking their queer audience by using their own cultural touchstones to celebrate the heteronormative status quo.
So if Byler was truly never the intended path, the non-Byler ending forced critics to reevaluate the characterization of the main players, particularly Mike. Without the lens of internalized homophobia to explain his distancing behavior, what did that do to Mike's consistency?
It was devastating to his character arc, according to the sources. Without the internal struggle of a suppressed identity, Mike's character, especially across the latter seasons, was seen as collapsing into an inconsistent, poorly written asshole.
A terrible friend to Will and a terrible boyfriend to Elle.
Exactly. He was consistently criticized for his inability to articulate his feelings or provide meaningful emotional support.
His repeated struggle to say, I love you to Elle,
suggested he remained deeply stuck with his emotions. Critics argued he was trapped in a contrived, almost stereotypical narrative, obsessed with Elle, not out of genuine romantic compatibility, but because she represented power and certainty, she was Superman to his Lois Lane.
His attachment was based on her utility, not a real connection.
That's the argument, yes. That it wasn't based on a deep emotional connection, and the flow-on effect severely damaged Elle's characterization too.
How so?
Well, Elle's climactic line, where she asserts that Mike had always understood her and always saw her, was widely criticized as a travesty because it simply didn't align with the objective reality of the show.
Critics pointed to Mike having gaslit her and made her feel like a monster in season 4.
Directly contradicting Elle's assessment. Even some Mylevin fans acknowledged that Mike's persistent emotional distance and inability to express commitment made the ultimate pairing feel unsatisfying and, frankly, unbelievable.
The show asked the audience to believe in a deep love that the character himself refused to validate verbally until the very last moment.
And this inconsistency, coupled with the way the show handled its only other confirmed queer relationship, made the creator's intentions feel clearer than ever to these critics.
Robin and Vicky.
Yes, the handling of Robin and Vicky was seen as a final narrative nail in the coffin. That relationship, which was confirmed on screen, was quickly sidelined and, according to the source critiques, eventually broken up off-screen entirely.
So it was interpreted as proving the creator's overall disregard for queer love as a serious thing.
Exactly. Treating it instead as something fleeting or secondary that didn't warrant the serious narrative weight, development, or resolution afforded to the heterosexual pairings.
The controversy then moved past mere critique of writing quality and into the realm of emotional and psychological consequence. The focus shifted heavily onto the mishandling of Will's journey.
Yes, and the difficult position the actor Noah Schnapp was placed in. This section addresses the pain point for many queer viewers, which is a feeling that the show validated the idea that queer love must be painful and earned slowly, while straight love is instantaneous and consequence-free.
The primary intellectual argument critics made here was that the Duffer Brothers engaged in psychologizing love. What exactly does that mean in this context?
It means that if Will had been a girl expressing the same lifelong devoted love for Mike, the showrunners would have portrayed it as genuine, destined romance.
Sure. The childhood best friends trope.
Right. Instead, critics argued, the show framed Will's genuine love as a gay self-delusion he should feel shame over and immediately move on from without any narrative investigation into whether Mike might reciprocate.
Or at least acknowledge the depth of Will's feeling.
Exactly. The narrative demanded that Will essentially cure himself of his affection. It sounds like they demanded an unrealistic standard of realism for the queer character, a standard they never applied to the straight characters.
That's the argument. The long-suffering gay boy was subjected to the narrative expectation of realism, told he wasn't ready to come out yet, and that finding love must be difficult and painful.
And this was set in stark contrast to the heteronormative self-insert fantasy gifted to Mike.
An emotionally stunted, nerdy boy who effortlessly secures a superpowered girlfriend he can keep happy just by offering a minimal "I love you."
Regardless of his previous poor treatment of her, the disparity felt unfair and rooted in harmful stereotypes.
Critics also found the specific setting and framing of Will's big emotional coming out moment to be deeply disappointing.
It was heavily criticized as being illogical and narratively weak. Viewers found it implausible that Will, seeking a moment of genuine, intimate vulnerability, would choose to come out to a large group of people.
A group that included Max and others he wasn't emotionally closest to.
It felt like a forced public proclamation for the sake of the plot. A cheapened moment that lacked the authenticity and intimacy the character deserved.
And the role of Noah Schnapp, who has since come out as gay, adds an almost heartbreaking layer of complexity here, particularly regarding the final scene with Mike.
It makes the narrative critique feel incredibly personal. Schnapp had been very enthusiastic about the Byler potential earlier in the season, almost to the point of spoiling things. However, leading up to the finale, he became visibly more muted in his commentary.
And the most damning evidence.
The revelation that solidified the creator cowardice narrative was that Schnapp had to actively request the final rooftop scene with Mike.
Wait, request it? The sources reveal that the writers initially intended to finish the series with no dialogue between them after Will's enormous emotional confession.
That is the critical detail. The writers intended to let the emotional bomb just sit there, unresolved. The scene that resulted, where Mike asserts they are best friends, was seen as the writers providing the bare minimum platonic dismissal.
Right up until the last possible moment.
And critics saw this minimal exchange as the writers laughing at us, actively denying Will the emotional hug or physical platonic intimacy he received from his brother Jonathan after his coming out.
The implication felt unavoidable. Now that Mike knew Will was gay, their physical closeness had to be actively restricted.
Because it might be perceived as too icky or suggestive. That was the interpretation.
If that was the execution, what overarching message did the fan base feel the finale was sending to the queer audience, especially young gay men who had seen themselves in this relationship?
The collective sentiment was that the ending delivered a cruel message, asserting to young gay boys that they don't deserve love and should perpetually doubt themselves when they dare to hope for queer love in their lives.
It validated the idea that their feelings are burdens to be overcome, not celebrated.
And the creators' public dismissal only exacerbated the emotional toll, feeding into the idea of delusion.
Right, because their comments about noise opened up the queer audience to unfair attack.
Absolutely. It gave homophobes ammunition to claim that fans were delusional for seeing subtext that the writers had clearly and deliberately layered into the show. It was a cynical move that resulted in the deep, careful analysis of a marginalized group being weaponized against them.
We also have the compelling critique that Mike's final status wasn't a win for heterosexuality, but a tragic failure of character development.
Yes, the Byler-aligned critique is that Mike's final ending was actually depressing. While Elle and the others found some form of resolution, Mike's future was characterized as grieving, lonely, and emotionally stagnant.
Because the writers suppressed his potential queer journey and refused to resolve his emotional distance.
He remained terribly written, trapped in an emotionally unsatisfying relationship. The sources conclude that Mike's lack of resolution was the sad consequence of the creator's decision to prioritize corporate conformity over character integrity.
It is essential to maintain balance here. Not everyone hated the finale. Many viewers loved the emotional resolution. What were the core arguments made by those who viewed the finale as perfect?
For many, the finale was described as perfect, satisfying, and beautiful, eliciting widespread emotional reactions. We have genuinely moving anecdotes, like one viewer's account of their father watching the analysis.
I read about this. It's a powerful story.
This father, who was revealed to be gay and had been in what is known as a lavender marriage for over 50 years, cried because the discussion brought him to the realization that he had wasted more than 50 years pretending to be straight.
For our listeners who may not be familiar with that term, can you briefly clarify what a lavender marriage is?
Certainly. Historically, a lavender marriage refers to a marriage of convenience between a man and a woman where one of both parties are homosexual or bisexual. It's often conducted to conceal one's sexual orientation from the public or family, to conform to societal expectations.
So for that father, the show, even in its subtext, provided a catalyst for a deeply personal late-life realization.
An incredibly powerful impact. Shifting to the narrative structure, defenders argued that the intricate logistics and plot holes don't matter.
Why not?
Because the fundamental heart of the story is the bond and friendship between the characters, which they felt triumphed in the end. For them, the emotional core of the group's connection overrode any minor technical flaws.
And some supporters also offered a compelling argument about the actual villain of the piece.
Yes. If Vecna and the Mind Flayer weren't the true villains, who was?
The argument is that the real monster was humans. Specifically, individuals like Dr. K and the military personnel who conducted heinous human experimentation and covered up their actions.
And crucially, these characters escaped accountability in the finale. This lack of justice for the human villains, defenders argued, reflected the real-world truth that evil will always exist in the world, even if the immediate supernatural threat is defeated.
The true conflict was societal, not dimensional.
That was the reading, yes.
Outside of the Byler controversy, one of the most talked about elements was the intentional ambiguity surrounding Eleven's fate. The show gave viewers two powerful yet conflicting possible endings.
That ambiguity was a massive creative choice. The two primary endings presented are either Elle died sacrificing herself to destroy the upside-down portal, or she survived but chose to live alone away from her loved ones, sacrificing her happiness for their safety.
And that uncertainty sparked intense analytical theories, most notably the Kali illusion theory. This isn't based on feelings, but on technical details of her powers.
Exactly. What supports the idea that Elle survived and her death was a setup.
What's the evidence?
There are several key technical details. Firstly, during the scene where Elle is hiding at the gate, proponents of this theory note she didn't show the expected physical exhaustion, pain, or, most importantly, the nosebleed.
The nosebleed is the signature visual cue of her powers being used to their fullest.
Exactly. The lack of that nosebleed suggests she wasn't physically present or exerting her real energy.
And the second point relates to the sonic suppressors used by the military.
Yes. The military had activated sonic suppressors near the gate, which are essentially Elle's kryptonite, designed to nullify her powers. If the real Elle were physically near the suppressors, it would have been impossible for her to communicate effectively with Mike in the void.
So the communication must have been projected by someone else.
That's the theory. And that someone is Kali, who was previously introduced as a character with the power of creating powerful, far-reaching illusions.
Kali, number 8. She was shown to have survived a shooting long enough to project illusions far away.
Right. It is suspected that she used her powers to project the entire Elle death survival sequence. This reading suggests that Elle chose both life and death, sacrificing her happiness for their safety while still physically surviving due to Kali's intervention.
It also brings Mike back into the fold, specifically his role as the storyteller. How does his character relate to the ambiguity of Elle's fate?
Mike is the one relating the ambiguous epilogue, specifically describing Elle's supposed new life near 3 waterfalls. Because Mike has been established as emotionally inconsistent and struggling with reality, critics suggest he creates this ambiguous, beautiful ending as a coping mechanism.
His description of her future life is labeled as his fantasy within the narrative,
meaning the audience cannot trust it as canonical reality. This loops back into the larger critique that Mike is an unreliable narrator, making both the Mylevin ending and Elle's fate questionable.
Even outside of the emotional or shipping debates, there were significant complaints regarding the mechanics, structure, and overall quality of the final season's writing.
Pacing was a frequent complaint, yes.
What about it?
Critics noted that the timeline felt severely skewed. Will's protracted internal struggle and coming out arc took a disproportionately long amount of time compared to the sequence dedicated to defeating the final boss, Vecna.
The climax felt rushed.
Many sources felt the ultimate climax was too brief and easy, arguing the confrontation should have been harder and longer by at least 15 minutes to justify the season's long build-up.
And what were the major unanswered questions and plot holes that the finale left hanging?
The list is long, indicating a rush to the finish line for some storylines. Major unresolved issues included the definitive fate of Dr. Owens, the lack of consequences for the military, the unknown location of the Demobats.
The nature of the Mind Flayer's true body, which was made of dust, not flesh.
Raising questions about its physical defeat, yes. And the fundamental question of how Will survived when Vecna died, given their established telepathic and potentially symbiotic hive mind connection.
Just to clarify, for the benefit of our listeners, what exactly was the established nature of that hive mind connection?
The show established a clear psychic and physical link between Will and the creatures of the Upside Down, especially the Mind Flayer, dating back to his first possession. This connection caused him physical pain whenever the creatures were near and allowed him to sense their intentions.
So when Vecna, the Upside Down's core consciousness, was defeated, it was logically expected that this connection would sever.
Or that Will would face severe consequences. The fact that Will simply survived without explanation when Vecna was supposedly killed was seen as a major narrative failure, violating established internal rules.
Despite the profound disappointment and feeling of creator betrayal, one of the most powerful and enduring outcomes of the Byler controversy was the formation of an incredibly resilient, creative community.
Yes, fans turned their heartbreak into a form of political and artistic action.
This transformation is the most inspiring part of the entire deep dive.
It is. The disappointment became a catalyst for self-discovery and collective empowerment. The Byler narrative and the intense effort required to analyze the subtext actually became a real-world catalyst for self-acceptance for countless queer individuals.
It provided them with the necessary courage to explore their identity and, in many cases, to come out to family and friends.
The sources contain incredibly moving personal anecdotes that underline this impact, proving that the story was never just about a fictional romance.
We have several examples that show the story's direct influence on real lives.
One fan shared an experience that mirrored Mike's struggle exactly, including internalized homophobia and actively distancing himself from his best friend out of fear. Seeing the Byler analysis, even with its negative outcome, validated his own internal conflict.
And there was another deeply moving story.
Yes, it involved a fan confessing their love to a childhood friend, realizing the evidence for Byler was undeniable, which gave them hope that gay people are not destined to be unhappy in every story.
And they not only confessed their love, but set a wedding date shortly thereafter.
That's amazing. So the community's engagement was a form of collective self-discovery and validation. They didn't need the show to tell them they were worthy. The act of deep analysis gave them that strength.
Precisely. Many viewers acknowledged that the entire experience of diving deep into the show's subtext taught them invaluable, real-world lessons in media literacy about symbolism, filmmaking, and screenwriting.
The process of analysis empowered them to see meaning and intention, where the creators later claimed none existed, inspiring some to pursue film school or careers in the creative arts.
The fan community became a teaching environment for cinematic decoding.
It tracks. If you spend years arguing the significance of a blue and yellow swing set, you learn how to look closely at every frame.
That level of meticulous analysis, that's PhD-level decoding of visual grammar.
It fundamentally equipped them with the tools to critique, understand, and then ultimately create.
When the creators failed to deliver the ending they felt was earned, the community immediately pivoted, taking control of the narrative itself. This speaks to a powerful creative rebellion.
It was an immediate and incredibly productive collective response. The community turned their frustration into artistic production, creating what they called fix-it fix, and art to cope with the canon ending.
And these fan-created stories were asserted proudly as being better than the professional product.
Because they were freed from the shackles of conventionality, they declared openly that they don't need Daddy Netflix for permission to dictate their characters' lives or to depict the queer joy they deserved.
This sounds less like typical fan engagement and more like permanently institutionalizing the vision the show denied them.
It is entirely defiant. The community formed on platforms like Tumblr and elsewhere declared that the emotional fire that Byler lit will not burn out. Byler Lives became a permanent, defiant mantra.
Establishing that the sense of community and the shared understanding of the subtext is lasting, irrespective of the show's official canon outcome.
They realized that in a media landscape driven by profit, they cannot rely on the capitalists to make our stories for us.
And the ultimate assertions from this community frame the entire controversy within a larger historical context of queer liberation.
Yes, placing the fight for fictional visibility on the same spectrum as real-world progress.
How so?
The community fiercely asserted their inherent right to love and self-expression, stating with powerful pride, "There's nothing to accept about us because there's nothing wrong with us." This fierce self-regard was connected directly to historical struggles, with commentators noting, "We didn't need a Stranger Things when we rioted at Stonewall."
The implied message is that if they could win profound, life-altering progress without mainstream validation, they certainly don't need a fictional show's permission to live their lives authentically.
And demand their narratives be treated with integrity.
The controversy surrounding the final season highlights a critical tension in modern media. The immense power that creators hold over representation and the equally powerful agency of the audience in interpreting and reclaiming narratives.
Right.
Whether you see the finale as a triumph of friendship or a cowardly, formist corporate decision, the impact of these fictional lives on real lives, inspiring self-acceptance, community, and creative rebellion, is undeniable.
It forces a necessary reckoning. In a media landscape that actively encourages deep textual analysis and promises meaningful representation for marginalized outcasts, the creators must be held accountable for the narrative choices they make.
Because dismissing a large, dedicated segment of your audience as noise after strategically utilizing queer subtext.
It invites legitimate backlash and ensures an ongoing debate about the ethics and integrity of storytelling for marginalized groups.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. If the creators deliberately planted enough complex technical evidence to mislead their audience and then claimed the audience's resulting deep analysis was just noise,
then does that mean that the true core message of the show, that outcasts deserve love, friendship, and happiness, was only ever meant to be delivered by the audience itself through their shared analysis and creative rebellion?
and not by the storytellers who initially profited from the subtext? Something for you to mull over as you reconsider all the symbolism you may have missed. When a global phenomenon concludes, disappointment is, it's almost guaranteed. But for millions of viewers, the finale of this beloved show wasn't just about some poorly executed monster battles.
No.
It was, according to the sources we are diving into today, the culmination of the most elaborate, cruelest queerbaiting in media history.
That is a staggering claim. I mean, cruelty that suggests intent, not just, bad writing.
Exactly.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really analyze the case against the great queerbait as it's been so meticulously laid out by this whole fan community, the Byler lawyer.
Right.
We're going to unpack the sheer volume of evidence that was presented for the Mike and Will or Byler romantic relationship.
And really get into how the creators allegedly strung along millions of fans.
Only to just dismiss that whole complex queer relationship as noise in the final moments. It's a lot.
Okay, so let's unpack that core idea first. Because if we're going to talk about cruelty, we have to define the alleged weapon here, queerbaiting. Based on the formal definition in the source material, how did they allegedly weaponize the audience's expectation?
Okay, so the definition is absolutely key here because it's what separates intentional harm from just a narrative that fails.
Right.
So queerbaiting is formally a marketing technique. Creators in fiction, they hint at, they tease, they build up a same-sex romance or, strong LGBTQ representation.
But, and this is the important part, they never actually show it.
They never depict or confirm it as canon. That's the bait.
So it's a calculated, almost risk-averse business strategy.
Precisely. The goal is to maximize your audience. You attract or you bait the LGBTQ audiences and their allies who are just desperate for representation.
So you get their viewership, their engagement.
All of it. And at the same time, you avoid alienating any conservative or, homophobic audiences or even global censors because you never actually commit.
You never have to show the thing you've been hinting at.
It's an IP safeguard that's just dressed up to look like narrative subtext.
And the argument here is that they didn't just drop a few ambiguous lines here and there.
Oh, no.
This was a meticulous, multi-season campaign of emotional investment.
The sources argue that the complexity of the clues they used is what made this so uniquely damaging.
How so?
They weren't just using vague glances. They were embedding deep, complex cultural and cinematic codes. The Byler lawyer analysis suggests the creators had prepared a literal mountain of evidence that, by all standard rules of storytelling, it all pointed to Byler becoming canon.
So they gave the audience the tools to do this deep analysis.
And then punished them for using those tools correctly. That's the core of the accusation.
Okay, so let's start with that central theory behind the backlash. The argument is basically that there is a planned narrative that, at the last minute, chickened out.
Right, that this ending was a reversal, that it was due to some kind of external forces. The theory points to this really clear split in the creative process. If you look at it, Volume 1 of the final season, according to critics, was actively and heavily building up Byler.
All the signs were pointing one way.
But then Volume 2 comes out later, and it seems just as determined to actively tear it all down.
That's whiplash.
Complete whiplash. And it strongly suggests some kind of internal power struggle, or maybe just immense external pressure that made the writers abandon a storyline they'd spent years setting up.
What kind of external pressure are we talking about? Do the sources speculate on the motive for such a massive change, of course?
Yeah, the speculation usually centers on market conformity. There's this persistent belief that the decision was influenced by corporate stakeholders.
Like Netflix.
Either Netflix themselves, maybe they were hesitant to commit to a major queer ending for, a global flagship property,
right.
or possibly the Duffer Brothers' future employer, Paramount. The sources suggest that the creators might have gotten, significant funding for their new enterprise, and they were afraid of jeopardizing future projects by delivering a controversial queer ending to their biggest series.
So they lost their nerve.
They lost their nerve, and they effectively chose massive future deals over their own character and narrative integrity.
Wow. And it's fascinating how this alleged tension seems to be reflected in what the actors themselves were saying publicly.
Oh, totally.
The shift in Noah Schnapp, who plays Will, that seems particularly telling.
It absolutely is. Noah Schnapp is openly gay, and in the early interviews, he was described as visibly excited about the season's direction.
Right.
But he was also, comically trying not to spoil anything.
Which suggests he knew something big and positive was coming for Will's art.
Exactly. But then you watch the later interviews after Volume 2 aired, and he's so much more muted.
Yeah, total change.
which led critics to conclude that something has happened behind the scenes that just dramatically changed the character's ending.
And his later statements about choosing future roles, those were read as a direct criticism of how the show handled Will's journey in the end.
That statement was scrutinized so heavily. He was talking about future LGBTQ plus roles, and Schnapp said he would only take them if the project really resonates and means something, and not just be another one for whatever diversity points.
Oh.
Yeah. And the implication, according to the Byler lawyer analysis, is that he felt the show used Will's identity for exactly that. For diversity points.
For audience engagement.
But without giving the story the weight or the meaning or the canonical confirmation it actually deserved. It was, representation for marketing, not for respect.
Okay, let's move to the hard evidence of the setup Exhibit A. This focuses on the mischaracterization of Mike Wheeler's behavior, which was supposed to point to this powerful arc of self-acceptance.
Right, and this is such a critical point because it grounds the whole queerbaiting accusation in something psychologically complex and recognizable.
What do you mean?
Well, Mike's inconsistent, often emotionally distant. I mean, his shitty behavior in the earlier seasons.
Yeah, he wasn't always the best friend.
No. And his inability to articulate his feelings, that push-pull dynamic. It was widely interpreted by queer audiences as classic signs of internalized homophobia.
Which is a real struggle.
A very real struggle where people fear and repress their own feelings because of societal pressure. So viewers identified with Mike. They saw this powerful, deeply resonant arc where he would overcome that repression and finally accept Will.
So Mike's flawed behavior was the hook. It made him relatable to queer fans who'd gone through the same thing.
He was the hook. But the sources argue that instead of validating that interpretation, the show just turned Mike into a caricature in the finale.
That's the profound betrayal.
It is. Instead of this difficult journey leading to self-acceptance, the show, according to critics, just made Mike an inconsistent, poorly written asshole who is a terrible friend and terrible boyfriend.
So the compelling psychological reason for his behavior was just gone.
Completely removed. He wasn't struggling with his identity anymore. He was just written badly. And that just stripped away the emotional identification from millions of fans.
Can you give some specific examples of his emotional failure in that final season?
There are so many instances that fueled the internalized homophobia theory that were just left hanging. First, there's Mike's repeated inability to just say, "I love you" to 11.
Even when she might die.
Even then. He treated her poorly, gaslighting her, telling her they were fine when they clearly weren't. But the most painful example, the one the Byler lawyer cites most, is that scene where he actively pushes Will away.
I know the one.
He refuses him an emotional hug right after Will has had his huge emotional coming out moment in the van.
Why did the denial of that hug sting so much for people?
Because it was seen as a physical manifestation of Mike's repression.
Oh.
Fans argued that Mike refused even platonic intimacy because he knew Will was gay and that Will liked him, and that made any close contact too icky for Mike to handle because of his own unacknowledged feelings.
And in the finale.
Instead of Mike overcoming that emotional barrier and finally embracing Will, that moment of denial was just never resolved. The character arc stagnated and the emotional wound was left open.
It's seen as deliberate cruelty.
It is. Building up a scenario where Mike's distance felt so real and relatable, only just throw away the complex reason for that distance.
Okay, let's move on to Exhibit B, because this is where the meta-analysis gets seriously deep. It's about the use of a classic narrative structure, the Cyrano trope.
Yes.
And critics argue it wasn't just used, it was actively bastardized to prop up a straight relationship.
This point perfectly illustrates the sophisticated nature of the queerbaiting claim.
So for anyone listening who doesn't know, what exactly is the Cyrano trope?
Okay, so it's named after the play Cyrano de Bergerac. Cyrano is this brilliant poet who's secretly in love with Roxane, but because he thinks his large nose makes him unworthy,
right,
he uses the handsome but inarticulate Christian as a proxy. Cyrano writes Christian's love letters, pouring his own true feelings for Roxane into them through the voice of his friend.
So the core of the trope is that the true feelings are eventually revealed. The hero is ultimately rewarded for their genuine vulnerability.
Exactly. But in the show, the roles were set up and then inverted and then just destroyed.
How so?
You have character A, Will, using character B, 11, as a proxy to express his desperate love for character C, Mike.
The painting,
and that emotional monologue in the van. It's supposedly on 11's behalf about how Mike is the heart of the group.
But it's Will. It's Will confessing his love for Mike, just filtering it through 11.
And the inversion, the bastardization, happened because Mike responded to Will's love, believing it came from 11.
And the lie was never corrected.
The travesty is that Mike falls in love with the painting and the confession, and the finale ensures that the lie was never acknowledged. Mike probably still believes those profound feelings were entirely 11's.
Wow. So Will's genuine, vulnerable love was just used as scaffolding.
It literally served to hold together the straight relationship. It provided the emotional depth that Mike's relationship with 11 was severely lacking that season.
That's not just poor writing. That's like emotional fraud written into the script.
It is. And the dialogue after that only made the betrayal worse. Think about Elle's line in the finale that Mike always understood her and seen her.
She didn't.
Critics argued it completely contradicted his actions in season 4, where he was ignoring her, gaslighting her.
So his big love confession to 11 was fueled entirely by Will's emotional truth from just moments before.
The foundation of My Levin's victory lap, as critics contend, was rickety. It was built upon the bones of Will's unrequited love confession.
This level of detail requires deep media literacy, which brings us to Exhibit C, the sheer volume of queer coding, symbolism, and those infamous music choices.
The mountain of other clues.
Yeah. The mountain that the creators allegedly encouraged fans to analyze.
The sources stress this over and over. The showrunners told the audience every detail matters. They basically gave the green light for this level of deep analysis.
And the fans just followed instructions,
only to have their meticulous work dismissed.
Let's start with the Dungeons & Dragons rules.
Yeah.
They were used as shorthand for character compatibility throughout the whole series.
Indeed. Mike is the paladin and the storyteller. Will is the cleric, Will the wise.
And in D&D lore,
Paladins and clerics are traditionally highly compatible. They're often paired because they have shared values, complementary abilities. Mages, like 11, are powerful, but they're typically independent, solitary roles.
so that was seen as intentional signaling.
A signal of a deeper compatibility between Mike and Will than Mike and Elle.
Then you have the pervasive use of the closet motif.
Oh, yeah, an enduring symbol of repression in queer narratives. The Byler lawyer analysis spends a lot of time on this.
It all hinges on the idea that Mike is repressed.
Exactly. There are specific Easter eggs, like Ted Wheeler smashing Mike's closet door in an earlier season, which is seen as representing the destruction of his ability to stay hidden.
And the Regomania scene.
The camera pans directly to Mike as the song In the Closet plays.
You can't make this stuff up.
And the most detailed visual evidence cited is the one-way sign pointing directly to Mike's closet, a subtle but highly specific cue, arguing that Mike's character arc was meant to move towards confronting his repression.
I mean, if the writers told us every detail matters, using a song explicitly titled In the Closet while focusing on a character alleged to be closeted, that seems impossible to dismiss as coincidence.
That's the entire point. It appears intentional.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the needle drops. The music cues that critics saw as the creators just winking at the audience.
Confirming the subtext without ever committing to the text.
Precisely.
So what were the most significant musical examples?
Two pieces of music drew massive attention. First, David Bowie's Heroes, played over the closing credits of a major season.
A bisexual icon.
Right, and the song is famously about forbidden or unacknowledged love to people who can be heroes just for one day.
So the fandom saw that as a promise.
They saw it as the creators confirming the subtext and promising a heroic conclusion for Mike and Will's forbidden feelings. Critics, though, later called its final use lip service to heroism from creators who lacked the courage themselves.
And the second example, that was played during a key heterosexual relationship scene, right?
Yes, Prince's Purple Rain, played during a pivotal My Livin' scene.
Again, a queer icon.
Prince's identity and music are so deeply intertwined with the queer community, with themes of defiance, gender fluidity, and critics argued that playing a song with that deep resonance over a purely heterosexual love scene,
Especially when they knew how closely the fandom was watching.
it wasn't just coincidental, it was interpreted as deliberately cynical or even evil, like a calculated move to capitalize on the queer coding in the music while using it to serve as a straight narrative.
And when they were challenged on these clues, the creators' explanations were less than satisfying.
That's the ultimate failure of trust. Take the song Small Town Boy by Bronski Beat.
Which is explicitly about a young person running away from home because they're being persecuted for being queer.
Explicitly. And the writers dismissed its inclusion as just reflecting that the character was a boy from a small town.
That's insulting.
It's seen as disingenuous. When you have this massive community dedicated to analyzing film symbolism, dismissing such specific cultural coding as an accident, it doesn't fly.
They invited their audience down a rabbit hole of subtextual analysis.
Only to later claim the audience was delusional for connecting the very dots the writers laid out. The argument is, if the details truly mattered, then the deepest, most complex pattern the Byler arc should have mattered most of all.
That exhaustive setup makes the failure of the finale even more devastating. Let's pivot now to the finale itself and why those choices were seen as the ultimate act of betrayal.
Right, especially for the characters who are meant to represent the outcasts.
Starting with Will's character arc, which critics felt was just utterly destroyed.
The critique of Will's ending is really rooted in a lack of respect for his emotional struggle. I mean, he's the original outcast, and his journey to accepting his identity was the most complex personal struggle in the show.
And his coming out scene in the finale was criticized for being both public and rushed.
It just felt so disrespectful for a character who spent years locked in repression, struggling silently with shame. A respectful, earned coming out would have been intimate.
To Mike, maybe? Or just his brother.
Right, to Jonathan. Instead, he comes out in front of a huge group of friends and, quasi-acquaintances, people he wasn't even close to.
It felt like a back-sticking exercise.
A rushed, obligatory plot point rather than the validating moment he deserved. It just diminished the gravity of his years of struggle.
The creators tried to deflect this by claiming his arc was about self-acceptance, not validation from Mike.
And that argument just immediately collapses under scrutiny, according to the sources. Because if their message was truly about self-acceptance, and that romantic validation was irrelevant to his happiness, then the ending should have focused on him finding peace alone.
But that's not what happened.
No. Instead, the epilogue gives him a new love interest. Specifically, this brief appearance of a cute college guy in a bar.
So the show proved that romantic validation was relevant.
Just not with the person they had spent multiple seasons setting him up to love.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Critics saw it as an attempt to have it both ways. They tried to retroactively validate the self-acceptance argument while actively avoiding the actual queer relationship that was narratively earned.
They just gave him a generic non sequitur love interest, making their entire argument for self-acceptance without Mike completely irrelevant. It was like the show saying, you can have love, Will, just not that love.
The one we spent 4 seasons building.
Yeah.
And then we have the final agonizing interaction between Mike and Will.
Ugh. The friends, no thanks, best friends moment. The sources highlight that as just a painful narrative slap in the face. It minimized the intensity and complexity of their entire relationship.
And it was made even worse by the revelation that Noah Schnapp had to actively fight just to include any clarifying dialogue in that scene.
Which suggests the writers originally intended to end the show with virtually no resolution or dialogue between them at all.
Despite their entire intertwined history.
The fact that an actor had to battle for scraps of dialogue demonstrates, critics argue, the creator's active disdain for the emotional payoff of that relationship.
And moving beyond Byler, the show's established heterosexual endgame, My 11, it also failed to land, even for people who weren't invested in the queer pairing.
That is absolutely correct. A lot of longtime fans felt the My 11 finale was just entirely forced. Critics across the board described it as lacking chemistry, a plot hole-filled train wreck.
The final kiss was frequently described as awkward.
Awkward. Stiff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that observation led some critics to interpret it not just as Mike's discomfort, but as a subtle visual cue supporting the whole illusion theory, which we can get into.
But even putting that theory aside, the main criticism is just Mike's fundamental lack of development as a partner.
He remained emotionally stagnant. Even when facing the potential death of 11, he still couldn't vocalize his feelings clearly or say, I love you.
He was stuck with his emotions.
Right through to the end. He hadn't evolved from the emotionally distant boy of earlier seasons. And the sources argued this creates a deeply problematic message.
Which is?
That a young woman like 11, who has suffered abuse and emotional trauma her entire life, should just be satisfied with a shitty boyfriend who can't communicate, is emotionally unavailable, and fails to stand up for her.
So the conclusion is that the writers prioritize the existence of the established straight relationship over character consistency or emotional health or even narrative quality. Precisely. The ending effectively rewarded Mike's emotional failure. He never had to do the hard work of confronting his repression or learning to be a good partner. He was just handed the relationship anyway.
It was unearned.
Completely. The Mylevin relationship was described as superficial and actively harmful in previous seasons, and the finale offered no reason to believe their issues were magically resolved.
And this betrayal wasn't isolated. The sources point out that other queer characters were also just carelessly sidelined.
The Robin-Vicky relationship, or Raviki, suffered a similar kind of narrative abuse.
Robin was one of the show's few established queer characters.
And they had her nascent relationship with Vicky broken up off-screen. Even more telling was Vicky's complete absence from the epilogue and the major final events.
Wow.
Critics noted that as a significant slight. It demonstrates that the creators don't see queer love as a serious thing, just something fleeting, unlike the various straight couples who all got their canonical resolution.
So the show claimed to be for outcasts.
The argument is that it was only for the cishet nerds, who eventually got their validation in love, while actively discarding the queer community who had invested most deeply in the show's subtext.
Okay, now let's dive into the most complex and, intellectually dense part of the Byler lawyer case.
The illusion theory.
The idea that Eleven's final love confession and her escape were actually an illusion crafted by Mike's own mind.
This theory relies heavily on media analysis and internal canon contradictions. Mike's D&D role, the storyteller, is key here.
So critics suggest his role is literal. He's writing the narrative he needs to believe to cope.
And the smoking gun, cited by the Byler lawyer, comes from an external source, the Duffer brothers themselves. In an interview, they stated that Elle should not have been able to communicate with Mike in the void.
Why not?
Because of the presence of kryptonite, the sonic suppressors designed to block her powers.
Wait, hold on. If the creators acknowledged that communication was canonically impossible,
then Mike's final loving interaction with Elle, where she confesses, he responds, and she tells him he always understood her, must have happened purely in Mike's head.
Wow.
That is the devastating conclusion. It means the pivotal moment used to cement the Mylevin endgame was a psychological construct, a hallucination or a denial mechanism triggered by Mike's intense grief and repression.
He needed to hear those words, so his mind provided them.
Overriding the show's own internal logic.
So if we accept that premise, where does that leave Mike Wheeler at the end of the entire series?
It creates a profoundly depressing, isolated ending for him. He's left grieving a lost partner while being highly implied to be a closeted gay man whose only path forward is through denial or fantasy.
And the theory suggests Mike's use of the word fantasy when describing Elle's escape.
That wasn't a casual choice.
He was literally labeling his delusion.
And crucially, this ambiguity extends to Will's one moment of potential happiness in the epilogue. Absolutely. Critics argue that if Mike is imagining the final crucial moments of his own story to cope, then that small, quick moment where Will meets a cute college guy,
that might also be Mike's imagination.
It becomes a manifestation of Mike internally saying, yeah, maybe you can go be gay somewhere else, out of my vicinity, so I don't have to confront my feelings.
He's isolating Will's truth into a safe, distant fantasy where he can't disrupt his own denial.
So what appears on the surface to be this triumphant, if poorly written, victory lap for the straight couple is actually interpreted as a profound moment of denial and delusion.
Fueled by repression and grief.
That is the tragic interpretation. Mike's final moments aren't success, they're failure. He's trapped in the Duffer's creation, forever grieving while failing completely to confront his own sexuality, having sacrificed his best friend's feelings to prop up his fantasy.
Given the depth of that analysis and the profound emotional investment we've detailed, the creator's official response is what elevated this from a shipping debate to a case of alleged cruelty. How did the Duffer brothers address their most ardent, detailed fan base?
The sources report that the creators referred to the Byler fandom and all the analytical arguments they produced as external pressure or merely noise.
Noise.
And this was perceived by the community as simply cruel. I mean, think about that language. Noise implies distraction, meaningless static, something to be tuned out.
It's deeply insulting to half of their most avid supporters, many of whom are members of the LGBTQ+ community.
I mean, if you're the person who has dedicated hundreds of hours creating meticulous film theory, demonstrating the show's own internal logic, only to be called noise, it's fundamentally disrespectful.
It's worse than disrespect. It's a dismissal of identity.
Critics argued that equating the complex, intellectual, and deeply personal analysis from queer fans to noise essentially told them that they were people who don't matter.
Their investment, their identification, their media literacy, all invalidated in one word.
And their lack of commitment throughout the seasons just compounded that feeling of betrayal. They refused to ever officially deny the ship, keeping hope alive until the last possible moment.
So they maintained that ambiguity.
Yeah. They kept the audience expecting something that didn't happen in the end. And this prolonged period of false hope, followed by the explicit dismissal, it just opened up the fans to immediate ridicule and hate.
From the other side of the fandom.
Exactly. Those who supported the My Love and Endgame quickly labeled the Byler fans delusional. Critics contend the creators are directly responsible for stringing people along, giving false hope to increase queer viewership, only to expose that marginalized audience to scorn in the end.
This wasn't just a disappointment over a fictional couple. The sources provide these heartbreaking testimonials illustrating the depth of emotional connection that was shattered.
Yeah, the stakes were intensely personal.
The connection went so far beyond casual shipping.
The source material shares the story of an older gay man who had previously entered a lavender marriage, marrying a lesbian woman to maintain a facade of normalcy in a less tolerant era.
Wow.
He saw his own repressed life mirrored in the Mike-Will dynamic. He followed the Byler lawyer videos and described crying, saying he wasted more than 50 years of my life.
Oh my God.
He found this profound, almost existential hope in the idea that Mike and Will, in this modern fictional context, can have what he didn't.
And when that hope was dashed.
This was described as reliving a lifetime of repression.
That is a staggering demonstration of the show's perceived real-world impact. The stakes were literally tied to personal identity.
Absolutely. Another fan shared that they had explicitly planned to use the moment Byler became canon as a sign to come out to their own conservative family.
Wow.
They noted that a global mainstream show validating a gay-male relationship could have helped real-world people navigate what is often the most difficult conversation of their lives.
And for that hope to be dashed, it reinforces a devastating message about the impossibility of achieving queer love in the mainstream.
And young people found validation in Mike's alleged repression, only to have that validation pulled away.
Right.
One testimonial shared by a closeted lesbian revealed she identified with Mike's fear and push-pull behavior toward her own crush, saying she pulled a Mike Wheeler and started pushing her away.
A recognized defense mechanism.
And finding the Byler community provided essential validation for those feelings, confirming that her behavior was complex, not crazy. When the show discarded that complexity, it left fans exposed.
But the personal stakes weren't only negative. The community fostered resilience too.
That's the crucial counterpoint. One fan credited the deep dive analysis videos for giving them the intellectual confidence and emotional push they needed to confess to their lifelong love.
That's incredible.
It led directly to an engagement and a wedding date set after the bar exam. The community's validation gave them the script the show failed to provide.
So when the show dismissed the queer storyline, what was the insidious message the marginalized audience felt they were receiving?
The overwhelming consensus among critics was that the show reinforced the dangerous idea that gay boys don't deserve love that's reciprocated.
And that seeking queer love leads inevitably to self-doubt and pain.
And being relegated to the side, fans felt they had been mocked for their deep investment and were left feeling horrible and unworthy of love.
But the story doesn't end with passive acceptance.
No.
The final act of the community was resistance, reclaiming the narrative through creativity.
This is the true power and triumph in the face of all this alleged cruelty. The immediate response across the internet was a massive surge of creative output, the production of fix-it fanfics and artwork.
Queer communities have always had thriving, non-canon shipping fandoms.
Right, because they're constantly denied representation in the mainstream. And the prediction is that this fan content will be top tier. We're talking multi-100,000-word post-canon fix-it fix.
They decided they don't need the validation or permission of Netflix or the Duffer Brothers to write their own happy endings.
Exactly. The community found a shared sense of righteous anger and pride, arguing they don't need daddy Netflix for permission to live and celebrate their stories.
They shifted the focus.
From pleading for representation to asserting their inherent right to love and self-determination, they drew inspiration from Will's powerful D&D moment as the sorcerer asserting his right to love, not begging for acceptance.
And the Byler lawyer summed it up.
Declaring that the community will continue to live the lives we are destined to live, fictional shows be damned.
What a meticulously detailed and frankly devastating case against the show's final creative choices. We've analyzed the elaborate setup, the failure of the finale, and the profound real-world emotional impact on a huge segment of the audience.
And the central point remains that the writers appeared to prioritize market conformity, a safe, established heterosexual relationship over narrative consistency and true character integrity.
They created a story that, in the eyes of many, actively harmed the marginalized audience it claimed to support.
It's clear from the sources that they sacrificed Mike's development, Will's character growth, and the coherence of the show's internal logic, all for the sake of a perceived, safe, straight endgame.
The controversy wasn't just about whether two boys should kiss.
No, it was about the fundamental collapse of media trust and the cynical manipulation of a vulnerable audience for profit.
So we end with a provocative thought that lingers over all this analysis. If the writers repeatedly told the audience that every detail matters and that the show was explicitly designed to be deeply analyzed,
which led to this international community producing hours of meticulous film theory.
What does it truly mean when those same creators dismiss that deepest, most complex analysis from their fans as merely noise?
Was this failure simply an act of creative incompetence, where the writers genuinely didn't understand the powerful subtext they were embedding? Or was this, as argued, a form of calculated cruelty, where they leveraged that emotional investment and queer hope for viewership and profit, only to dismiss the queer community when it was time for the final, potentially controversial commitment?
It's a tough question.
It is. But the evidence suggests that the Byler fandom has taught millions of people more about media literacy, symbolism, and sophisticated film analysis than the show itself managed to in its disappointing final moments. That dedication to meaning and detail is what will endure long after the final credits roll. And that is a story the community is now writing for themselves.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.